Welcome back to the Cast Pulse podcast. I'm your host, Carlos Beck Viana, Director of Marketing and Communications at Cast. Before we get into today's conversation, I want to flag a couple of things on our radar. Cast is releasing a new publication in March titled Integrated Management of Fire-Adapted Invasive Plants That Change Wildfire Regimes. The paper examines how invasive plant species alter fuel loads and fire behavior across North American landscapes and what that means for land management, public health, and policy. It was chaired by Greg Dahl, the Western Society of Weed Sciences representative on Cast's Plant and Soil Sciences Workgroup, and Matt Bauer, director of the Western Integrated Pest Management Center. If you're heading to the Western Society of Weed Science annual meeting in Tucson, Arizona next week, Greg and Matt will be leading a panel discussion on the topic this Wednesday, March 4th, from 3:30 to 4:45 in Canyon C Hall. For everyone else, we'll be hosting a webinar release of the full publication on April 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Registration will be opening soon, so keep an eye on cast-science.org for details. All right, on to today's episode. Today's interview was conducted by Kaylee Kleitsch, our Programs and Engagement Manager here at Cast. She sat down with Alan Norden, Secretary of the Minor Use Foundation Board of Directors. Alan spent 26 years with the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, serving as Executive Director of Registration Management and Director of Minor Use. He also chaired the OECD Expert Group on Minor Uses and contributed to key guidance documents on regulatory incentives and the use of international data. These days, Alan is doing capacity and capability work in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, training regulators and governments on pesticide assessment. Today, they're talking about MRLs, Maximum Residue Limits, what they are, how they affect farmers in global trade, and what the future looks like for minor and specialty crops. It's a topic Alan knows well, and one he's currently bringing to Cast as chair of an upcoming paper on maximum residue levels.
So, can you tell us a little bit about what MRLs are, give a little bit of background and why they're important?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, we're probably all aware that, crop protection products get registration, and what happens as part of that registration process when the regulator does an assessment is it results generally in an MRL, or a maximum residue limit, and the regulator sets those limits according to the use pattern that's actually been approved for the product. Now, why they're important is that they're used as monitoring tools to ensure that people comply with label instructions. And then they're also used in the food supply chain in relation to ensuring that those products, when they're used according to those approved instructions, will be safe for consumers to consume those products.
So, talking a little bit more about MRLs, what impact do they have on agriculturalists? How can we see them working on farms, and how do they, have an impact on farmers and agriculture supported communities?
Yeah, they work in both a positive and sometimes in a negative way. So MRLs in a positive light, guarantee market access when they're met. But when producers or exporters are looking at global markets, they can and do become a barrier, particularly where in markets that may be missing MRLs or have different or lower MRLs. So these negative effects can often limit the available tools and registered products that farmers can use, or how they can use them. So they might need to change the ways that they use these products, or which ones that they can actually select to actually meet those different market requirements that have different or sometimes lower MRLs or no MRLs at all. So that can then start to limit, farm profitability, how much produce can come off the farm. Does it meet requirements for typically what consumers are looking for in terms of, clean, nice looking product at times? And I guess that profitability issue really flows into the broader rural communities that rely on those primary production systems within those communities. So it can have an effect, particularly from an economic point of view, much more broadly.
Kind of on a broad sense, what do you wish that more farmers knew when it came to MRLs?
Yeah, I think just that they exist and that they need to be monitored by growers, particularly, if growers are looking at an export commodity, or if some of their produce, they know that it might actually end up in export consignments by further down the supply chain. As I mentioned earlier, some markets may be missing MRLs or have lower limits MRLs. And it can be a costly exercise to have produce decline market entry or result in other forms of testing to maintain or gain that market access back.
So, could you give us a little bit of insight on the impact on minor and specialty crops specifically?
Yeah. At the Mining Use Foundation, our vision is to support growers globally in accessing safe and effective crop protection solutions. That includes both conventional and biological tools. So some require MRLs and some, like the biologicals, may not. Just to explain, the crops we work with encompass the vast majority of fresh fruit, vegetables, and nuts, which are commonly grown on smaller areas of land than larger row crops like corn, soybeans, wheat, and other major cereals and grain crops. The commercial sector, from a product registration perspective, really focus their attention on those bigger agricultural crops as they deliver a bigger return on investment than crops grown on smaller areas of land. So we look to help those growers who face challenges accessing registered solutions in minor and specialty crops. These crops are then even more affected by global trade issues with MRLs, as the global landscape of MRLs in these crops is even much lower again, as many of these crops are not grown in all regions of the world. Crops like coffee, tea, a lot of tropical fruits, spices, and even many vegetables are not grown in all export markets. So they can really suffer challenges when it comes to trade.
Do you think you could tell us a little bit about some of the science driving, the work and decisions being made surrounding MRLs?
Yeah, sure. I think an important thing to understand is that, MRLs are backed by science, and that's a really important point. They're established based on field studies that are conducted under global best practices. And then those studies and the results from those studies are considered in some detail, particularly to ensure they meet agreed health standards to protect consumers.
So, diving a little bit into the policy side, what are some key things that are happening in the policy sector regarding MRLs?
I'll touch on two things. The first one I'll talk about is crop grouping. And just to explain what crop grouping is that this is where regulators and Codex have done this as well in relation to setting Codex MRLs, is that we group like commodities. So all our allium vegetables, our onion crops, for example, will all go into a single group. All the berry fruits, pome fruit, citrus, and etc. and so on. There's over 20 different crop groups that we actually operate on. And what we do then is we utilize representative data from some of those commodities to enable MRLs and registrations to be established in the broader crop group. So citrus fruit, pome fruit, as I mentioned. So that's a big, significant, I guess, a policy change. And this has been around for many years. A lot of the work that supports the crop grouping came out of the United States IR4 project. They've done a lot of work over going back to the 90s and potentially even the 1980s in establishing these crop groups. That work then flowed into Codex. So there's been a lot of work done around adding more crops into the Codex classification of foods and animal feeds. And then also looking at what representative commodities would be ideal in a majority of situations. So again, that's a very important aspect, crop grouping, and we're seeing more countries looking at that tool and method of establishing MRLs, particularly to assist the minor crops, the minor and specialty crops that we spoke about just a little bit earlier, because otherwise those commodities would not get any registrations. The second point I would talk about would be we're seeing a lot more government support, particularly again for the minor and specialty crops, because governments can see that these commodities are very high value. They're quite economically important to regions, and they're exported commodities in a lot of cases. So governments are looking at ways that they can develop either country programs or even regional programs that might support growers with access to safe crop protection solutions for those minor commodities. And that might be through also establishing programs that generate data to support those registrations where needed.
On a personal note, when folks are crafting policies regarding MRLs, do you think that they should be more risk-based or hazard-based policies?
Risk-based. All systems conduct hazard assessments as part of their risk assessment, but it's critically important to then ensure the system being employed is a risk-based system. That's one which considers not only the hazard, but also if those hazards represent any risk through expected exposures, and if or how any risk mitigation strategies being employed would be suitable, such as what sort of personal protective equipment is going to be used, what sort of buffer zones may be employed. Would there be a situation where you could mitigate risks through the numbers of applications or even rate of application at times? And I think the important point on this would be, from my perspective, is that science is not only about understanding your hazards, but it's also about understanding what exposures are likely to result and can you adequately manage them.
So similar to a question I had earlier, what is one thing that you would want policymakers to know about MRLs?
They can have a big impact on farmers and consumers' food supply. So we need to be understanding that to ensure that farmers have access to, the most modern technology for safe food supply, be that conventional or biological products, that we need to be finding ways to give them tools. The other one that we spoke about was ensuring that, we have risk-based systems for setting MRLs. The other one would be around areas where countries would have systems in place to enable MRL setting, even for commodities that they don't grow in their region. So again, we earlier spoke about how MRLs can have a trade impact where they're missing or they might be lower in some cases. So a number of countries around the world are looking at not only adoption of Codex MRLs, which we would highly support in relation to MRLs, but also looking at setting up import MRL programs in countries and also having legislation in place that enables countries to do that. What we have noticed is that some countries do have an ability to establish import MRLs or to defer to Codex, for example. So there are a number of things that countries can look at in relation to not only their domestic or local MRLs, but how they can establish MRLs that would facilitate trade, both for their producers and for other producers sending product to their country.
So can you expand, how can different MRL standards between countries have an impact on global trade? And with that question, who's seeing the most benefit and who is being negatively impacted by different MRL standards?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's the differing MRL standards that we talk about, and the common terminology we use is, missing or misaligned MRLs. And the way that that can impact global trade is that, as I mentioned earlier, it could restrict a producer's ability or a farmer's ability to use a crop protection solution, how it's been registered in their country, just because that market either doesn't have an MRL or it has an MRL at a different or lower level. The global trade then, if your commodity is going not into one market but into many markets, which it is in a lot of cases, is that it can be a little bit of a myriad of trying to work out those different standards that exist across the globe. So it's not just one market that could affect the way that you use products. The issue on the trade then is that if this produce gets picked up in the market or in the export market and it doesn't meet those importing country requirements, it can have significant impacts in relation to that food being, or the commodity being, rejected. That might then need a situation where that product has got to go to another market, but particularly in relation to perishable fruits and vegetables, for example, that's very difficult to achieve. Now, this doesn't mean that a rejection at a market necessarily implies that that food is not safe. It just doesn't have an MRL in that market where it's trying to enter, because the destination market where it's come from, the producer's country, has made a decision that, it met the requirements of safety when it was registered. So the MRL, in a way, is, even though it's not there, does not necessarily imply that the food is not safe. It can have a significant impact on the global trade of food. So who's seeing the most benefit and who's being hurt? I think more people are being hurt than people having benefit. I can't really think of a benefit at the moment, but I guess being hurt would be, the producer, the exporter, but then also the consumer. You have less choice in your food supply. Some of these products are marketed around the world. I call it out of season. So in other words, they may not be produced in season in your country at that point in time. So they're coming to your markets from other regions of the world. So you have less option and availability of food in the supply if it's getting knocked out because of MRL issues that are not actually presenting any human health risk.
All of that being said, do you think that global MRL harmonization is a realistic possibility?
Oh, that's a dangerous question. I think the harmonization in the way that we set MRLs and establish MRLs is moving in that harmonized direction. So there's been a lot of work done, particularly by OECD and also by Codex. There are calculators that are now used to establish MRLs. So that means, if two people in different regions of the world could be looking at very similar data sets, historically they might actually derive different MRLs just on the way that they considered the science. Now, that doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong. However, with the development of a calculator, that calculator is now resulting in more harmonized, and it gives a recommended MRL. That doesn't necessarily mean that that needs to be absolutely followed. People can still move away from that. However, more and more countries are using the calculator and harmonizing those MRLs. So I think it's genuinely realistic in relation to looking at similar data sets. The other harmonization, I guess, is it's probably more about trade than it is about MRLs in some respects, as I see it anyway. So it's about the acceptance of food complying with requirements for human health and safety. So I think we need to look at, how do we establish importing policies in relation to food that moves around the world? And is that MRL based, and where do those MRLs come from, is a consideration that needs to be made. So I think it's realistic that we are seeing more countries and more governments really stand up and look at this whole MRL issue, because it is creating trade barriers for their producers, and governments are doing a lot more and becoming a little bit more proactive in trying to address this issue. So I think the harmonization is realistic. It's going to take some time to get there. And there are a number of ways that, where we're working with producers to manage the current situation at the moment.
Obviously, when it comes to MRLs, you're somewhat of an expert. But when you think about the general population, specifically consumers, do you think that they're aware of what MRLs signify, even if they have access to the numbers?
Yeah, I think generally if you threw the word or the acronym MRL at them, they probably would not know what it was. But if you told them that there were maximum residue limits set for, pesticides in food, they would generally understand what a MRL then was. But I think one of the things that they probably don't recognize is what they actually signify. And I'll come back to really early on in the discussion, I spoke about how regulators set MRLs based on the product that's being registered, and importantly, how that product is being used. So I'll try and give an example of this in simple terms. So we might have a use in a particular commodity, and I'll just use maybe apples as an example. So country one might have an apple use pattern, and the pests that they want to control might need a certain rate of application and a certain number of applications to be applied to it to control that pest. Another country might have the same pest, or it could be a different pest in apples as well, with the same chemistry being used, but they might use a different use pattern. So it could be, maybe it's a lower rate, it could be lower numbers of applications. So what I'm saying is that you could have the same product in two different markets being used in slightly different ways. And because they have different use patterns that end up with different rates of application being applied to the commodity, when those two countries look at the data sets, they're likely to derive different MRLs, because one will give higher residues than another one. But both are safe. So when we do human dietary exposure assessments on those MRLs, they're likely to be very, very low in relation to their dietary exposure, and they're acceptable. So I guess one thing that I think that consumers wouldn't maybe know about MRLs is that in most cases, they're not safety limits for human health and safety. They're limits that are established to monitor that the growers in country one and country two followed the use patterns on their labels.
How can MRLs influence the cost of food production and ultimately food prices? I know you alluded to this in some of the earlier questions and answers, but could you dive in a little bit more how it might affect the day-to-day person?
Yeah, well, particularly in relation to market access, again, there could be a need at the producer level to, change around products that are used. There could be issues with product being destroyed because it's not likely to meet market access. And that's not just an MRL issue, but it could be an MRL issue that's driven the inability to control certain pests and diseases that has resulted in, more produce not meeting market expectations. So that could potentially drive up, food prices.
So in some of our previous conversations, you mentioned some work that you do with the USDA. Could you give us a little overview of what that entails, especially regarding some of the ASC projects happening in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, sure. So the ACE USDA project work that I'm involved in, and just to explain, ACE is assisting specialty crop exports from the US into a range of markets all over the world, particularly in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. So the work that we've been doing there is some of the work that I sort of mentioned a little bit earlier, where, governments are looking at ways that they can establish import MRL programs, for example, or ways that countries can establish deferral programs. And that may include, deferral to Codex, deferral to other regional MRL-based systems that are in place, and having sort of cascade systems in place for MRLs. So What I mean by that is that, the domestic market might still set its own MRLs, but then, if you're selling or sending cranberries, for example, to somewhere in Southeast Asia, they're not likely to have an MRL for cranberries because they probably don't grow many cranberries. So in those sort of situations, we're looking at those countries establishing, deferral programs to things like Codex, and also having situations where they would establish particularly import MRL programs, training those regulators in those regions, how they can do those risk assessments for those import MRLs and the procedures to do that. So there are guidelines that have been established. So there's an APEC guidance document on establishing import MRLs and the process to do that. So we're teaching and speaking with countries in regions in a number of places about how they can establish these programs.
Looking forward, how do you feel about this topic when you think about the future? Are you optimistic about the work that's being done right now?
I'm fully optimistic. As I mentioned earlier, I joined the foundation in 2020. I'm really honoured and pleased to work for the Minor Use Foundation. We're always pushing forward in relation to looking to new ways that we can help producers, and it's a positive outlook. There's a lot of challenges, and particularly in the minor specialty crop space is, a lot of those challenges are around, finding ways, and in areas where we need to do data generation, how can we get sufficient funding available to do that important work, to generate that residue data. Then just generally on the MRL area and trade, what I mentioned again earlier, we're seeing a lot more countries stand up and take a little bit more notice about how MRLs are impacting their trade. And when I mention their trade, it's not just trade outside leaving the country, but also trade that's coming into the country. And I think those, I call them policymakers and the science and the regulators, knowing again how I mentioned about, the MRL in itself is not a health standard, but it's really set for that good agricultural practice. So the use pattern that's approved in each country and how they can be different. I think they're recognizing a lot more that, the science of food safety goes beyond your own domestic MRL. And there's a need there to look at ways to, facilitate and, in a way, not impede that trade of safe food. Because even though a commodity may not align with your domestic MRL, or you may not have an MRL for that commodity in your domestic market, that does not mean that that food is not safe. And we need to find ways to alleviate these trade barriers. So I think sort of looking forward, there's a range of positive efforts that are going on globally. Some of the work that I'm involved in, and there's a lot of work elsewhere as well. So there's a lot of good, positive people involved in that work. A number have been involved in it for many years. And I know there's a community out there that is pushing for trying to enable growers to access, safe and effective solutions, adopt the most modern technology, and importantly, looking after those minor crop growers that would not otherwise have support in these areas. So, yeah, very optimistic and looking forward to working in this area for many years to come.
That's great to hear. Is there anything else that you think is notable or that you want to share with listeners that you didn't get the chance in any of those questions?
I don't think so. The only other thing I would probably mention is that, we need to work together, and this is policymakers, it's the regulators, broader government, and growers and the crop protection supply industry as well, to find and develop pragmatic ways based on science to support the things that we've spoken about today, to support MRLs and to support, trade in safe food. It's ultimately ensuring that we have a, safe, affordable food supply that's globally accessible by all communities. And I think that we just need to keep doing more work in this area and supporting our producers.
That was Alan Norden, Secretary of the Minor Use Foundation Board of Directors, in conversation with Kaylee Kleitsch. If you want to learn more about the Minor Use Foundation and the work Alan mentioned, we'll link to their website in the show notes. And a reminder, the CAST publication on invasive plants and wildfire drops in March, with a live webinar release on April 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern. Registration coming soon at cast-science.org. Thanks for listening to the Cast Pulse podcast. We'll see you next week.